Well, Janice said that you look like a happy group. I'm going to take care of that real quick. It's about the longest hour and a half you will ever spend in your entire life. I am a statistician, and if you've had the privilege of sleeping through a statistics class in the university, you'll know that we have absolutely no sense of humor whatsoever. It'll be a long hour and a half. A friend of mine who's known me for a number of years now said, Bill, I finally figured out what a statistician is. Said a statistician is a person who likes to work with numbers, but really didn't have the personality to become an accountant. So, now before you laugh, I'm going to probably tick off every other profession in this room before this hour and a half is done. Here we go. What I'm going to try and talk about are three things today. First of all, I'm going to talk briefly about, out of all of the characteristics, out of all of the ways that Dr. Deming has characterized his philosophy, that other people have characterized his philosophy, I have, in my over 20 years that I've been associated with Dr. Deming, come up with my view on trying to characterize Dr. Deming's philosophy. And I've picked out of all of those characteristics some that I consider key, some that if you really took these on board, you would see what I consider the essence of what Dr. Deming is talking about. After I do that, and it's only about one slide worth of that, it truly is a summary, but it will help put it in a framework that we can then begin to talk to you about how you might want to operationalize the philosophy. I'm going to talk about a theory for transformation, a method for transformation that has been used over the ages, both Eastern and Western cultures, for change. Peter Schulte spoke a little bit about change yesterday, the last period. We consider the process of change so important that I'm going to talk about it as well, so you're going to get a double shot of how you might go about changing. That's why many of you are here. This philosophy is not new. Different people have used different words in different cultures and different professions throughout ages, and it's been effective, or the underlying method for change, whether you're talking personal change, individual change, whether you're talking cultural change, scientific change, religious change, economic change. It's phenomenal how this method has been applied throughout the ages. And finally, I'm going to try and be extremely specific. Many times it's fun to try and list what's wrong with, and that's definitely good fun, listing what's wrong with what we're doing today in our businesses, in our lives. But I'm going to try and talk as specifically as I can about what were some of the things that we did at Ford. Now, I've arranged my comments to specifically make sure that they're not manufacturing oriented. I'm going to talk about things that are applicable to any organization, because I'm going to be focusing on some of the things that the top leaders are concerned with. And that's what I spend primarily my time now as a consultant, patterning it after how Dr. Deming has approached his consultancy, and that is to spend a few days a month with the top leaders in their meetings where the real decisions are made, not necessarily quality kinds of things, but finance, strategic planning, people meeting. So these top board meetings and situations is where we spend our time. Another way to couch some of the things that I'm going to say, I've had the privilege over these past 20 years or so to have, first of all, learned from Dr. Deming in my time at New York University Graduate School of Business, and then in over 1,000 occasions where I have accompanied Dr. Deming when he has met with the top leaders of industry and academia and government. And so what I'm going to do in this brief hour and a half, even though it's going to seem extremely long, is share with you just a snippet of what these experiences have taught me. So, my understanding of some key characteristics of the philosophy of Dr. Deming. A few years ago, when I was asked, how would you define the essence of what Dr. Deming is talking about? In fact, how would you define the essence of any quality philosophy? I said unhesitatingly, well, it's to reduce waste, to reduce defects. The focus over 10 years ago of quality was to reduce defects. Who could argue with it? I mean, that sounded like a very good thing to do. 10 years ago, or 9 years ago now, when we pioneered this thought at Ford, it was a revelation that quality, that what Dr. Deming was speaking about was certainly the elimination of waste, the reduction of defects, but it was a lot more than that. My understanding of what Dr. Deming is talking about is primarily one of balance. It's a balance between the elimination of a negative and the addition of a strong positive. A lack of a negative has never connoted a strong positive. You want your customers to brag, to take delight, to take joy in what it is you're delivering them, whether it's an internal customer, external customer, other parts of the system. You want your customer to brag about it, not just not complain. This was revolutionary 9 years ago. It's pretty much old hat right now. But I see that as a very key characteristic of what Dr. Deming is talking about. You may belong to a culture where the unwritten law is silence is agreement. It's another example of a lack of a negative doesn't connote a strong positive. You leave the meeting in one of those cultures and you wonder why things don't get done the way you thought they would get done, because silence has never meant agreement and never will mean agreement. You might not have an adverse variance in a budget review. That's a lack of a negative. You might think your company is operating fine. Lack of a negative does not connote a strong positive. The systems, this has major implications. The systems that you have set up, especially in Western cultures, the systems we have set up that focus on searching out those negatives and trying to figure out problem solving, however you want to describe it, and then getting rid of them and then feeling good, are not the same systems that are going to be able to search out and be able to add value, to be able to figure out what it is that gives your customer joy. It's a very important first key characteristic. Dr. Deming speaks about constancy of purpose. He also speaks about continual improvement. It's a balance. You might say, well, which one is it? I see constancy of purpose as establishing a value system that is an oasis in this very turbulent and dynamic world that we live in. It is that constancy of values that Dr. Deming is talking about. And you balance that with a continual improvement of everything that you do in your life to live those set of values. Constancy of purpose, continual improvement. Even in continual improvement, I see a balance. Many people think of continual improvement in the Japanese framework of Kaizen, incremental, day-to-day improvements. It also is what Joe Duran would call breakthroughs, what some management consultants would call possibilities. The huge increases that can occur. It's both of those, and it's a balance of both of those. You don't want to bet the farm going for these home runs, to use the jock analogy, all the time. You need to have incremental improvement as well as large improvements. When we speak in Western cultures, specifically in the United States, we specifically emphasize the team. Specifically emphasize the team, mainly because our pendulum in the Western world is swung way over toward the side of the individual, and that's fine. We are a society that celebrates the individual. That's only half of the story. One also needs to celebrate the sense of family, that sense of team, that sense of society. And in our formal systems, we have celebrated the individual. And so what we're trying to do when we speak to Western societies is say, you've got to move that pendulum over to begin to celebrate the team as well. We are not saying that team is the vision. No way are we saying that. Team is not the vision. There are many things that can be accomplished by individual brilliance, individual initiative, individual charisma. We have celebrated that individual, and we should continue to celebrate it. What we need to do is balance that with a sense of celebration of team. When we speak in the Far East, we stress the individual. Theirs is a society that has definitely figured out how to celebrate the team, the society, the family. Some might say too much. Dr. Deming would argue we have too much celebrated the individual. In celebrating the family, if you belong to a society where the nail that sticks up is hammered down, one might say that is celebrating it too much. However, each of those approaches, either of those approaches, is a very powerful approach in the personal sphere, in the economic sphere, in the political sphere. What we need to do in our formal systems is balance that sense of individual with that sense of team. You're not giving up over here the individual. When Dr. Deming speaks about optimization of a system, we just spoke about space. I can draw my process boundaries around me as an individual, or I can begin to include more and more people. That's optimization of space, depending on where I deal with my process boundaries. There's also optimization of time. When we speak over here in Western cultures about time, we say don't compromise the short term or the long term to the extent that you have in the past. We need to look at the longer term in the Western cultures. Japanese cultures, Eastern cultures need to focus more on the short term. They have a pretty good lock on the effects of long-term decisions. Every decision that you make is going to balance or compromise, quite frankly, the short term and the long term to some extent. Over here, you've got to begin to stop compromising the long term to the extent that you have. So that's space, time. Many people say that, by golly, if only you focused on the process, focus on the inputs, that's where you should work at. If you ignore the outputs, you're in just as much jeopardy as if you ignore the inputs. You don't know enough about this world and never will know enough about this world to focus on the inputs. One needs to balance inputs and outputs. In fact, in my worldview, and we're not really going to get into it here as far as a process definition, but inputs and outputs are the same thing. One person's input is another person's output. If you're looking this way, you might see them as outputs. You look at it this way, this interconnected system, you might see them as inputs. But you're looking for a balance. You cannot ignore the outcomes. We hear a lot, it's fashionable to talk about synthesis. You hear a lot of folks from Eastern cultures talking about the answer is synthesis. You need to step back and look at the whole. That's a valuable perspective. It isn't the only one. Western cultures typically have celebrated analysis. You're going to take things apart. There's nothing bad in taking things apart. One needs to balance, however. Are you going to look at it micro, or are you going to step back at it and see the forest for the trees? You need to do both of these things. You do not ignore analysis, in the fad of synthesis. Going to step back and look at it holistically. That's important. I don't want to say it isn't. One needs to balance, and wherever you are in the swinging of this pendulum, you need to recognize that balance. And last but not least, we see that, well, we now need to we're in a knowledge revolution. The half-life of much of professional knowledge is measured in months now instead of years or decades. It's in months. And so the emphasis on knowledge is extremely important. However, it is again one of balance. Knowledge without action is just as useless or dysfunctional as action without knowledge. We belong to a society that says ready, fire, aim. You get a lot of management consultants saying, by God, just as someone paraphrased yesterday, don't just stand there, do something. Dr. Deming would say, don't just do something, stand there. One needs to begin to recognize that you need a little bit of knowledge. You need to balance knowledge with action. In industry, what we would do typically, we'd take a young graduate or a person just out of school, just beginning work, and put our arms around the shoulder and say, we'll show you how it's done in the real world. We'll show you the ropes. And academia, the folks that supposedly were the helping you with knowledge, have prided themselves on being the bastion of theoretical purity. We know what we should teach, and industry is just too stupid to listen. One needs to begin to get a balance of action and knowledge. I'll tell a quick story about the great Charles Steinmetz, great electrical pioneer, retiree from General Electric. Steinmetz, this is in the 1950s, had retired from General Electric, and a big facility that General Electric had built had gone down. It didn't work, and the best engineers couldn't figure out what caused the breakdown. They spent about a week trying to figure it out and couldn't do it, and so they called Steinmetz back in from retirement, and Steinmetz walked around, looked around the plant, talked to the people, asked some questions. When he was walking around, he took out a piece of chalk, went to a piece of machinery, and put an X with a piece of chalk on the piece of machinery, put the chalk back in his coat, and went home. Well, the engineers are standing there saying, what has the great man done? So they go over, take apart the piece of machinery, and sure enough, right under where he put the white X was the problem. They fixed the problem, and the facility came back online immediately. It was fantastic. So Steinmetz, this is in the 1950s, a retirement wasn't too spectacular, so he sent GE a bill. He sent him a bill for $10,000. Now, the accountants at GE are not unlike any other accountants. They said, wow, can't pay this. We need it itemized. So Steinmetz sends back a letter, and he says, okay, chalk, $1. The knowledge that it took to place the chalk where it should be placed, $9,999. So when we speak about balance between knowledge and action, that's more of my idea of a balance. But other folks might have it somewhere in between. These are the characteristics that I see are key in the philosophy of Dr. Deming. Now we're going to talk for the next 40 minutes on a philosophy, sort of an overview of a philosophy for change, philosophy to make the transformation, the method to make the transformation. As I said, Different people in different societies, different professions have used different words, but they all connote the same three worlds of change. It is how all change takes place, and it is what change takes place as well. All change takes place, in my words, I'll share those with you first, on physical, logical, and emotional levels. Levels perhaps isn't really the right word, because that connotes a hierarchy, and there is no hierarchy here. Physical change is no better or worse than logical or emotional. There's no hierarchy, and that's one of the more important things you've got to remember. If you are from education, you might recognize the words psychomotor, cognitive, and affective, Bloom's taxonomy, if you will. That's his word, or Bloom's words for physical, logical, emotional. Peter yesterday put up Bennis, Bena, and Chin's view. In fact, I don't have the highly academic terms. I don't have even the space on this small slide. As you recall, power coercive, which is physical, rational empirical, logical, and normative affective, which is essentially the emotional side of change. Many of you are probably familiar with the old saw, the hand, the head, the heart, physical, logical, emotional. Some systems look at dividing the human personality up into physical, rational, and spiritual. Dr. Paul MacLean, this is one of the things that sold me on this view of the world, this framework, has observed that the human brain, has three separately distinct cellular structures. When we talk about the brain, most people think of the neocortex, right brain, left brain. You got two other parts of the brain, the R complex, certainly the neocortex, and the limbic system. And a lot of communication, and we'll see the interactions between each of these physical, logical, and emotional worlds of change. And there is certainly in the brain as well. As government, academia, and church is one way of looking at the world. Some people have used those words. Many philosophers have looked at the world as masculine, rational, and feminine. I got to point out here that rationality is not the purview of any gender, so we don't want to get off on that. If you're an epistemologist, you might be familiar with the terms percepts, concepts, and emotives. Even our accountants recognize this very profound view of the world when they speak of financial capital, intellectual capital, and goodwill, physical, logical, emotional. In the West, Western philosophers, Plato specifically speaks about his tripartite personality of appetite, reason, and spirit. Mencius, Eastern philosopher, pick on him. Others have used similar expressions. Speaks about acts and knowledge and will. Some Western philosophers speak about will when they speak about the emotional side. When you look at the latest theory of power, as pointed out to Dr. Deming by Dr. Kleekamp, the latest position on the latest theory of power, there's physical power, formal power, as Peter spoke about it yesterday. It's power because you occupy the position. There's an authority, there's power in that position. You got a biglow on the floor and the name on the door, as the old ad said. There's also power because of knowledge, and there's power in personality, power in charisma, but those are physical, logical, and emotional. Even Carl Jung's view of the world, and popularized by the Myers-Briggs type of personality, follows this particular mode of thinking. or categorization, if you will. Some of the main categories that they speak about are sensing, thinking, and feeling. It's physical, logical, emotional. When you were a Boy Scout, you knew a lot about change, even before you did physically change, when you said physically strong, mentally awake, and morally straight. Again, the theories, the categories are physical, logical, emotional. I want to point out that, first of all, change, as I said earlier, is not hierarchical. There is no preference. I mean, not preference, but there is no hierarchy. That one mode of change or kind of change is not better than any other. And this is where we have a lot of trouble, because the other point I want to make here is that each of us is comfortable in one or a combination of these levels, of these worlds of change. And one of the bigger mistakes that we can make as we try to help others in our organization or others in our life make change or help change themselves is that we think that if it works for me, it must work for everybody else. And we make a judgment there, and you see this a lot in the social sciences, judging that physical change is not desirable, not as effective as affective, as the emotional stuff. It's because these people live in those worlds. One needs to recognize a sense of balance. Now, the way I've shown or tried to show that there's no hierarchy and you need this sense of balance, this sense of centeredness, I'm going to say, is by using this Venn diagram. I know it's a logical construct. Some of my biases are coming out. And I apologize for oversimplifying life here, but if you can think of, here's physical, logical, and then emotional. If you can think of the intersection between physical and logical as science, think of the intersection between physical and emotional as art. The intersection between emotional and logical is fairly obvious. You go to the root of the word psychology, logic of the soul, that's psychology. You can begin to recognize some of the topics of what when Dr. Deming speaks of profound knowledge. This has evolved to be my framework for a very complete system of profound knowledge. And in the center, where they all come together, Eastern philosophers would talk about harmony. Western philosophers, Maslow specifically, would speak about peak experiences, when you're in the groove, when they all come together. This center position is highly unstable. I mean, with slight changes, it's a region where the whole can be a lot greater than the sum of its parts, and it can also be a lot less than the sum of its parts as well. This works for individuals as well as organizations. Again, no hierarchy. What works for you, you might be fairly secure in this area of the world. That's fine. That's perfectly fine. What you've got to recognize is that there are different ways of looking at what's happening in the world, and what works for folks who live around here won't work for folks necessarily that live around here. And that's neither good nor bad. It's the way we are. One of the things is the way we are. It's unfortunate that the English language, anyway, is fairly linear, and so it's going to be difficult to talk about all of these at the same time. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to talk first of physical, but that's not doesn't indicate any priority. What are the kinds of things that you would see in physical change? And again, this is one of my major internal consistency checks. I'm pretty comfortable in the logical world, and so if I come up with a plan for change in an organization, you can probably be sure that I'm going to cover stuff that the logical world folks would cover. As an internal consistency check, your plan for change for yourself and for your organization needs to You need to step outside of that logical world or whatever world that you feel very comfortable in, and you've got to recognize that I might need to shore up my plan with some physical and emotional, or any one of those combinations so that you have a balance. You need to be able to reach, your plan for change needs to be able to reach a whole bunch of constituents that are not like you. And so you need to use this as an internal consistency check. What do you see in the physical world? I don't want to stereotype folks, but a lot of folks have, in their judgment on the physical world kinds of change that you see, have said, well, it applies to hourly workers. And it's old, outmoded stuff because of the connotations of either carrots or sticks, coercion or whatever. This physical world change is necessary for change for many, many people. It's also sufficient for some people. That is, some people, if they have a significant physical event, can change immediately. Some people have a significant logical event, could have had a V8, can change immediately. Some people, you all have heard of significant emotional events, there are those too, those can affect change immediately. You can also go from physical, people talk about communication. You're going to go from awareness to understanding to commitment. That's physical, logical, emotional words. Some people need to go through that path. Some people don't. Don't make the mistake of thinking that you've got to have understanding before you've got commitment. Because of emotional strings, you have some folks who will follow you through the door and don't have to understand at all where the hell you're going because they'll follow you. So don't think that you've got to build it that way. It could be emotional, logical, physical. It could be any combination of those or each of these singly. Many times, again, people have stereotyped while we're talking about hourly workers when we're talking about physical stuff. I've seen many top leaders say, Bill, just tell me what you want me to do. Give me the list of things so I can walk the floor and do this. That's neither good nor bad. Many people need these physical kinds of things. One of the first things in my list of change in this physical world is policies, procedures, standards. Those are very, very necessary for many people and sufficient, as I said, for others. Mission statements are part of this. I know, now, there are some of you here that need mission statements, job descriptions. There are others of you in here that if you had to do another mission statement, you'd tear your hair out and run out the door. It's neither good nor bad. It's absolutely essential for some people. This is one example of physical change that you had better have in your organization if you're going to change. Physical error proofing. A lot of the things that you see coming out of Japan, a lot of the things that many manufacturing people see. The premise of this is that I can physically force something to happen and I can physically prevent something from happening. You know that. That's easy. The visual controls, the poke yoke, the pull system, things that are visual or sensual or sensory are physical kinds of changes. As I said, many of the things that people bring back from their trips to Japan are on this physical level kind of change. Organizational reporting relationships. Physical, I mean, it could be logical. I could have put it in the category. The importance here is that you think of these things. As I said, it's an internal consistency check. I mean, some organizations do have some logic to them. But I put it in physical because if you report to me, you're going to essentially do what I say you're going to do, at least until I'm reassigned or you're reassigned. So it's more of a physical relationship. That's why I put it in physical. Copying of examples, benchmarking, very popular, useful for some people, absolutely irrelevant for others. You see this phenomenon on all three levels. On the physical level, it's called benchmarking. On the logical level, it's for you Harvard Business School graduates, it's called case studies. And for some of you, it's called gossip. all it is on the physiological and emotional world. You want to see what some other, and hear what some other folks are doing. It's a very reasonable thing to do. Benchmarking, you need to, although in my opinion, benchmarking is peripheral vision. If you take your eye off the customer, you're going to be in big trouble. But one needs to see what's going on in the world, and that can be very useful. Rewards or punishments. I know when I was in the Navy, we used to keel haul people to get their attention. Can't do that anymore. Can't do that anymore. However, they can't do that in industry either. They can, however, get your attention by assigning you to the quality control department. That'll dead-end your career real quick. Must be a lot of quality people in here. You don't think it's too funny. It's really a sad commentary on where the quality profession historically has been. Not too much respect in the profession. You don't see too many CEOs coming from the quality profession in spite of a lot of the rhetoric. In any event, there certainly are punishments and rewards that are part of this physical world. One needs to understand how to use those intelligently with some logic, however. And training and the development of skills. These are the tools, a lot of socio-technical tools. We're not just talking about control charts, variation. Brian spoke about variation yesterday. Extremely important, mainly, and we stress that because it's something that you more than likely have not had an opportunity in your educational and developmental experience to have acquired a formal appreciation for. And so we stress variation, the various tools. However, you've got to understand that you can't go around. There is, first of all, no one tool that's ubiquitous, that's going to be universal, that's going to be useful in every case. And many times we see people as they go through these tool trainings to make the mistake, think that if the only tool you have is a hammer, it's surprising how many things start looking like a nail. And you go to these tool things and say, by God, I'm going to use a control chart everywhere. I'm going to do a Pareto chart. I'm going to do a Taguchi experiment all over the place. There is no one tool that's going to be able to be universally applicable for you. So there are a whole bunch of socio-technical tools. In the logical arena, again, I don't want to stereotype, but you've got some accountants and engineers and scientists, other folks live in this world. It's neither good nor bad. It's sufficient for some folks who live in this world for change. Some folks who are really centered in this world, you put the equation on the board, it's logically consistent, consider it done. You see the equation, they understand it, consider it done. Other folks, it's necessary, not sufficient. Other folks, it's irrelevant. Neither good nor bad. Case studies and examples I spoke about. Promotions or demotions. I put this in logic because of several experiences that I've had. I'll talk briefly about them when I get to that section of my talk. But suffice it to say that the logic, I put it here because our logic was that because many people were saying, well, you talk a good game, but you're not promoting people for the right reason. And until you do, I'm not going to sign up for this stuff. You got too many people being promoted for moving the metal in the auto industry vernacular, doing the same old stuff. And so we constructed several situations where we were able to give an area manager and an operations manager, a statistician, an OD person, a quality person. And over about a year and a half, these organizations, small and large, were able to go from inarguably outside the system on the low side, really needed help, to inarguably outside the system on the high side. I mean, costs went down, quality went up, morale went up, everything we said that would, good that would happen, happened. And on top of that, we made a big deal of promoting these people, sending the signal we logically thought that their peers would see that you can get promoted for doing this stuff. And some people did come around, but they're still waiting at both Ford and GM. I mean, we figured the doors would be blown off. Not the case. One of the things I learned from that is that you have to listen to people very carefully, because when people make suggestions, you can be extremely sure that what they're suggesting will work for them. Might not work for anyone else. We get a lot of folks in middle management saying, by God, if only you made quality part of the bonus equation, those top managers would fly straight. Don't make that mistake. What you do is you store that away. The person making that suggestion, it's important to them, and you use that at an appropriate time in the future. Well, I'll talk about that again in a minute. Explanations of how or why, obviously a logical construct. I'm not going to tell you why, though. Education or the improvement of knowledge, where you don't have to see a distinction. I do. It's no big deal. I see a distinction between knowledge and education, between knowledge and skills and education and training. Many times they're combined in delivery, but I see skills and training as physical development, and education and knowledge as logical development. One of the two useful quotes of this gentleman is pretty catching. He said that, surprising that a German made that, but he said that that nobody ever convinced anybody on the basis of logic, and even logicians like consultants use logic only as a source of income. He also said there's nothing more frustrating than arguing with a person the entire day on the basis of logic, only to find out that you were up against his will, the emotional part. This brings us to the emotional world. This state, again, I don't want to over-stereotype the thing, but many people in the OD community, many artists in that intersection there of physical and emotional, sales, marketing, live in this world. And in fact, when Dr. Deming speaks about joy, you need to be able to take delight as well as reduce fear and anxiety. Those are emotions. And many people, when we talk about joy and delight in this emotional world, you get a lot of pragmatic businessmen saying, you do that on your own time. That's not, work isn't for fun here. You not take joy on work time. You got to use your own time. So you've got to be able to live in this world. My first recommendation is that if you cannot, is first of all to recognize that there are different worldviews and different ways that people are comfortable in operating in life, and that is very important. It's more desirable, in my opinion, to help in your individual improvement to become more centered yourself, not geographically, not so that it's all bland, because there's a lot of strength in diversity. But in many things, you need to be more centered, to use a philosophical term. This, I know I pushed the button and I shouldn't have. A few years ago, when I would be going through these physical, logical, and emotional, a person in the audience came up afterwards and said, "Bill, that's great, but I really didn't see any. I couldn't feel the emotional thing that you spoke about." And me, being a preeminent logician, had written the emotional part in absolutely ironclad logical statements. And so this is my attempt to classify the emotional feeling, at least as this is going to be as emotional as I get in public anyway. So I'm going to go through three statements here. One is, if you can think of Obi-Wan Kenobi, okay, saying, "The Force is within you, Luke." Now I'm paraphrasing that a bit. What I'm trying to say here is, and I think most philosophers or psychologists would agree, that motivation is internal to you. You don't motivate anyone else except yourself. Motivation is internal to you. And now that I mentioned psychologists, it was interesting to see that they too have three worldviews or three camps of psychologists. There's the behavioral psychologists, cognitive psychologists, and psychodynamicists, physical, logical, emotional. One of the frustrating things that you see in any profession is that each of these professional bodies, even though they're all psychologists, absolutely swears and will fight anyone to the death on that their worldview describes everything that happens. The behavioralists will argue nurture. The cognitive psychologists will argue the cognitive stuff, and the psychodynamicists more of the emotional. And again, what I'm going to urge you to do is step back and look for balance. It's the same in science. It's the same in any of these professions. You've got polarized views of a whole lot of things. And each of those views can explain all that you see. They're not going to argue that at all. What you need to do is come up with more balance. In the musical Les Miserables, there's what I consider a fantastic song. Some of the words go, when the beating of the drums echoes the beating in your heart, there's a life about to start when tomorrow comes. Now, I know I haven't developed the background for it, but the beating in your heart is your individual voice of the customer. The beating of the drums is the external people, materials, methods, equipment, and environment voice of the process. And the job of all of us is to bring those two voices together. And when the beating in your heart, what's important to you at this time in your life, can be echoed by the beating of the drum, you really are going to be able to sing. On this emotional level, this is I think a darn good metaphor for what it is that we're doing. What will make one person laugh, and this is important because it's personal to each of you as individuals. What will make one person laugh will make another person cry. The same combination of people, materials, methods, equipment, and environment. It's very personal to you. This is one of the reasons why, and I'll talk about it. I'm getting ahead of myself here a little bit, but I'll make the statement. The only thing that, I can't say the only thing, but mass training or big audiences like this are good for awareness kind of venues and entertainment venues. I mean, that you can do on a mass level. When it comes to the emotional development, when it comes to the logical development, when it comes to your physical development, it's very personal. It's one-on-one. That's certainly why and I think that's why Dr. Deming has preferred to work one-on-one with people. That's where I can address the physiological and emotional opportunities that each of my clients has. And it's very personal. You can't do it on the average, in spite of the fact you really would like to, let's get this stuff going. You can't manage on the average. You can't do this on the average. And lastly, we've got the reduction of fear and the increase of joy. So that's the physical, logical, and emotional. Since I'm on emotional, sometimes some of you may be, perhaps a lot of you may feel like this. You are a change agent or a person who helps other people change. And you might say, it is so. This is how you're greeted by your peers, certainly before your time. We can all identify with this. It might be useful to bring Dr. Deming in to clarify the situation, and it may help. Sometimes, at least we knew at Ford and at General Motors that you got to get your foot in the door. And sometimes when the president or the chairman says you ought to look at this, that helps. That helps. Now I'm going to summarize some things here. First of all, here you see the physical, logical, emotional. worlds of change, that change takes place. I have superimposed this with three process relationships that I know we haven't covered, but it's an obvious categorization here. You have a process that I classify as dependent. That is, you're completely dependent upon either your customers or your suppliers on the physiological, emotional level. Here you have the statement, paraphrase, feed me, teach me, love me. Do it for me, teach me, love me. It's all dependent. When you're first born, you're completely dependent upon your parents. There's not, there are many situations in your life where you're dependent upon someone. Now, initially, that's understandable. Now we've got independent, the statement that says, this is a lot of our culture. We celebrate the individual. I did it. I understand what I did, and I take great joy in me doing it. And we have the interdependent. We did it. I understand how I fit into this family or to this system, and I take great joy in belonging to this family. So what you have here are essentially 9 pigeonholes of actions that you need to come up with specific actions to help people, to help others, to help yourself, but also to help others make the transformation. Now, when I say to help others make the transformation, I know many people have said, well, you yourself have to first make the transformation. I disagree with that. You yourself have to begin the transformation, and as you're on that journey, and it may be continuous, it might be discontinuous, but if the important thing is that you're on the journey, and other people will see that you are on the journey, and other people might be influenced by the fact that you've started. The person who has seen you begin the journey, make the effort, might change immediately, far before you make the transformation. Making the transformation yourself isn't the important thing. It's starting the process that I consider the important thing, because you can influence a whole heck of a lot of other folks just by being on the journey, even though you don't make the transformation. Another thing here is that we've got to be careful of is that, for especially all you logical folks, or folks that respond to logic, and that is that you see a 3x3 matrix, you see a 2x2 matrix, and you automatically think the ideal is in one of these corner cells. In fact, some folks would say that would automatically jump down to say, the ideal state in this whole thing is I take great joy in being a part of this family. It ain't the ideal state, although some people think it is. What we're looking for here, again, is balance. What you need to do in your plan for change and you're helping other people to change is to have a push system. That's why I put this in red here, that process model part in red. You have to be able to push people out of dependency, whether it's physiological or emotional dependency. It's not a desired state. You also have to have specific steps that balance independent and interdependent. Now you notice when I'm lumping these two together, I've eliminated the cellular boundaries here because it's fairly dynamic. You have to have a system that begins to balance that independence and interdependence on all 3 worlds, physiological and emotional worlds. When you look at a maturing process, you had to listen to Dr. Deming very carefully yesterday, because he said that in Western cultures, that if you leave a system unmanaged, it's going to, it will dissipate, and you begin perhaps fighting amongst yourself, or it'll be chaos. Carefully stated Western cultures. In some cultures, the people will come together. Other cultures, they won't. Again, we are a culture that celebrated the individual, and we've shown what we can do by celebrating the individual. What we're going to need now is more of a balance. In Western cultures, you see, and again, it's an oversimplification, the maturing process is one of dependence to independence and we talk a good game, and you see vignettes of it, the interdependence, but we've got a fairly difficult time in our formal systems with interdependence. In Eastern cultures, the maturing process goes from dependence to interdependence, and in spite of some of the rhetoric, we've got a difficult time with the independence. Again, one of the things that you see, if you belong to a culture, and many of us do, belong to a culture that celebrates the individual, and you cannot, in spite of the rhetoric, feel a part of a family at work, what do? You will go offline to find that balance in your life. Every one of you find a way to balance that sense of feeling good and being important as an individual and being an important part of a family, a team, a society. And if you can't do it in your formal life, you'll balance it offline in your informal life. Peter Drucker has observed that the highest and the fastest growing sector in the United States right now is the volunteer sector. No surprise. If you can't feel connected at work, you're going to go offline to help people. You're going to join groups that you can feel a part of a family, belong to a family, not just the rhetoric that happens at work. Finest bunch of people you ever had the privilege of working with. Well, the systems and the actions don't go along with that many times. Likewise, if you belong to a society that says the nail that sticks up is hammered down, you're going to try and find a way to be important as an individual. You're going to go offline. Many times when I go informally, meeting with people from Far Eastern cultures or cultures that celebrate that sense of team, that sense of family, that sense of society, they say, this was my idea. This is what I did. Dr. Deming picks on the game of golf. I will too. You probably couldn't figure or find a more highly individualistic game than the game of golf. Again, it's no surprise that it's extremely popular over in some Far Eastern countries right now. It's a chance somehow to show what you can do as an individual. It doesn't require too much cooperation or from anyone. People will find a way to balance that sense of individual and that sense of interdependence. I had mentioned that it applies to individual as well as team. Again, I'm not going to get on the soapbox too much, but in my consulting or personal training and conditioning, if you will, assignments, if you think of physiological and emotional for you as an individual, if you spent an hour and a half a day, I know that's a numerical quota, but if you spent an hour and a half a day, I know there's only 25 hours in a day. That's something I learned from the Watergate hearings. Senator Sam Ervin, colorful gentleman, said back in North Carolina that he got a client because the client came to him because the client's former lawyer was over a period of a few weeks charged this client on the average charged this client 25 hours a day. And the guy looked at the billings and he said, well, how can you do that? And he says, well, I work through lunch. So you can work if you work through lunch. There are 25 hours in a day. But out of those 25 hours in the day, you need to take an hour and a half hour if you worked on the physical level, breathing, exercise, diet. That will improve your physical well-being. On the logical level, if you took a half hour a day with puzzles, logic puzzles, reading something to improve your knowledge, if you had the self-discipline to do that. On the emotional level, whether it's meditation or prayer or a number of other things that can help your emotional well-being, you would be a far better person yourself, and if you had the self-discipline to do that, you also would be a better person for your organization, for your family. And quite frankly, it's just a matter of self-discipline. Now, there are all sorts of tricks, and what we do is help people individually set up a schedule of physiological and emotional individual improvement. I just mention that as an aside. Now I'm going to talk about, we've got about a half hour, I'm going to talk about some of the things that I did at Ford to help. I'm going to focus this on the leadership group because, as Dr. Deming says, and I can't overstress this, that quality is made in the boardroom. It's the quality of the decisions that the leadership makes that far outweigh whatever happens on the shop floor. It's not that the shop floor is not important. It's vitally important. Like every organ in your body is important. But quality is made in the boardroom. And so I'm going to talk about some of the things on the physical, logical, and emotional levels that we did that I considered important that you might consider doing at your place. Now again, I'm going to quote Engine Charlie from way back, what's good for General Motors is good for America, right? Well, what's good for General Motors or what's good for Ford might not be good for you, but it may be a good story. I mean, this will give you some idea of what we worked on. On the physical level, it's top management's job, in my opinion, to come up with the constancy of purpose statement. It's management's job, leadership's job, to come up with that vision. What is the aim of the system? What is the aim of the organization? That's the leader's job, one of the leader's jobs. And so it is very important for you as leaders or you working with leaders to get your leaders to make this physical statement, come up with the constancy of purpose statement. At Ford, it took about a year and a half. At Ford, and I'm not saying this, not trying to be derogative about it, just making a statement. At Ford in 1982, Ford didn't have a mission statement. Now, a lot of you will say, well, that's fine. It was whatever Mr. Ford wanted. It was a family-owned company, essentially, and whatever Mr. Ford wanted was fine enough for the rest of them. It's neither good nor bad, but I see it very important to have this physical constancy of purpose statement. What I've found is, over the years, that it's important, even though this is a physical statement, it's important to be value-oriented. That gets you into the emotional area. But because values are able to withstand the test of time. So it's important to come up with that at Ford, it was called the Mission Values Guiding Principles Statement. At General Motors, it was called the Beliefs and Values Statement. Again, the value-oriented is very important. Ford, it took about a year and a half to do. General Motors, it took about 6 months to do. In one of my clients, it took 4 months to do. It's not necessarily a quick thing to do. In a smaller company, you're able to get the people together, the leadership team, and if you spend the time on it, you can come up with a statement. As Phil Caldwell, former chairman of Ford, said, every word weighs a ton. Certainly to some people, to him it did. And so you cross the T's and dot the I's. I knew that. Didn't make a good staff person. Okay, so that is important. That is important to a lot of people, and so don't slough it off. There was an organization of leaders. NAO is North American Automotive Operations. That's the Ford acronym for it. GM said I can name that tune in 3 letters, and they said NAO, North American Operations. But it's the same thing. It's defined by geography what those 2 big companies do within North America, Canada and Mexico, in their definition. There's a strategy committee. It is very important, if you can, not to separate out this quality thing. Some companies, some organizations need to. I recognize that. But quality should be a part of the everyday conduct of your life, of your business. If you look at some of the major components of running a business, you've got quality, certainly. You have cost, very important. You've got delivery, and we've broken quality from its negative and created a category called greatness. the greatness of the service that you render or deliver, or the greatness of the products that you deliver. Extremely important. You don't want to put your quality hat on and say, well, we're going to do a quality meeting now, and then turn your hat around and have a financial meeting and say, now we've got some real decisions to make, and treat them as separate things. You would like to be able to conduct your business integrating this philosophy with how you conduct your business. So these NAO strategy meetings or committees in both GM and Ford were very beneficial, because one of the important things was it sent a visible signal to the organization that quality was important to these top leaders. They didn't succumb to the urge to delegate out some of these things they were deliberating on. At one point in time at Ford, the strategy committee met a half a day a week for about 9 months. That's a lot of time for the senior people to spend there. And they came up with all sorts of conclusions. They didn't delegate it out. They dealt with the issues. They collected data, tried to follow the PDCA cycle, PDCA it was back then. They listened to the philosophy, and they didn't delegate it, and that's the important thing. Now, the conclusions they came to were unremarkable. I mean, if you asked anyone in the organization at the conclusions they came about, that everyone knew it already. But what was very, very important was management sent the signal that this is for them. They resisted the urge to get it out of their office too quickly. Quality is part of the labor contract. Historically, both labor and management have said, at least in the auto industry, that quality is so important that it shouldn't be belittled by making it a part of the collective bargaining process. Quality is so important. And so for years, the quality initiatives were not part of the book, were not part of the contract, and you had thousands of people, both in labor and management, not participating in this quality process. Not because they were bad people. No amount of logic, no amount of wrapping yourself in the flag are going to appeal to a person who says, looked at my job description, not going to do it. It's neither good nor bad. If it isn't in the job description, if they don't feel they have physical permission to participate in this thing, they're not going to do it. This last iteration, and in this iteration, we made it a part of the book. Made it a part of the collective bargaining process. It's now in the book, and what we have observed at GM and at Ford, thousands of people are coming out of the woodwork saying, it is in the contract now, it is in the job description, how can I help? And they're looking for step by step, but they've at least joined the party, and that's very, very important. So if you have contractual relationships with any of your employees, with any of your suppliers, with any of your customers, make sure that the contract includes language that invites people, permits people to participate. The product development process. Again, this is a process that's essentially managed by the top leadership. This is also a process that will include most every discipline, most every profession that you've got in your organization, whether you're developing classwork, whether you're lesson plans as a product, whether you're developing a surgical procedure as a product, whether no matter what it is you're developing or delivering, your product development process will reach everyone. I would strongly urge you to quickly come and learn as you improve this process, but to focus your improvement efforts around this product development process. In the auto industry, it was worth billions of dollars in savings. The products get better, the cycle times get shorter, every discipline gets involved, from the people, human resources, to finance, to strategic planning, certainly the engineers, certainly the folks doing the manufacturing, all of those people get involved. Even the customers, sales, marketing. So if you were to pick a process that you can get the top leaders involved with, this would be the one. And a performance measurement and feedback system. This is recognizing that many figures, the important figures, are unknown and unknowable. There are a whole bunch of figures that are known and knowable. There's variation there, there's a distribution there. But the figures that you use to manage on a day-to-day basis are known and knowable. At least you think they are. At General Motors, we had over the years evolved to a situation where 2,500 measures were reported to the central office on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis. 2,500 measures over these years. You can imagine the amount of staffs at central headquarters, at the regional stuff or geographical staffs, and out in operations that were required to collect all of those data, to analyze those data at various levels to make sure that their asses were covered, and at the corporate level to analyze the data to come up with some way to ask a question to get an aha. I'm overstating it a bit, but there were thousands of people easily involved in that over the years. So what we found is that some of these data were, and this big process for collecting the data were started 20 years ago because some vice president asked a question, in one particular case on manufacturing efficiency, and because of fear in the organization, it took a while to get the information 20 years ago. The staffs took it upon themselves to make sure that that information was continually collected in case this guy asked that question again. A lot of waste of resources. And you find this in any company. You do a lot that there's a lot of waste that you don't have a clue that goes on in your organizations until you dig into it. In any event, it took about 2 years to have a very intensive effort to look at all of those measurements, and we reduced the amount of measurements from 2,500 down to about 60. You can run a large company on 60 measures. You can actually run them on 20 measurements, but in order to get it approved, what we had to do is give each key vice president his or her favorite measure. And so it went from 20 and we added 40 more so that each of them would buy off on it. In any event, 60 is a lot better, I would submit, than 2,500. The important thing about those 60 is, and again, none of them individually is remarkable, but they're an interconnected system. You don't talk about, you don't go in and say, inventory turns is one very good measure that perhaps any business would look at, whether it's turning of boxes in a warehouse, whether it's turning of cash. Accountants, the cash flow is an inventory problem with accountants, medicine, all sorts of, wherever your organizations are concerned with inventory. The problem is that you can look good on inventory turns by doing the wrong thing for the company. And that is, the problem of any ratio is that you have to pay attention to what's happening in the numerator as well as the denominator. You can look good on inventory turns by shipping everything premium freight. It's not necessarily good. That's a high-cost way of doing business. So one has to, and so what we did on this measurement system is to show every one of these items over time, plotted the dots as Brian was talking about yesterday. Every one of those measures, we have an indication of variation over time. Obviously, we're using graphics, and every one of those measures, we show what downstream measures it influences and what upstream measures influenced it. We've looked at it as a system, so you can't look good on a quality parameter and sacrifice cost. One of the famous things that was shouted down the tubes a few years ago, and again, you've got to recognize that overtime is a significant cost to the auto industry, to many companies. Someone shouted down the tubes, knock off overtime. And everyone saluted and said, okay, I'll knock off overtime. And then 2 weeks later, what the hell happened to schedule? Well, schedule and overtime in some companies are inextricably connected at this point in time in their development. You knew what the trade-offs were beforehand, and you should, if you looked at your measures, those that are visible anyway, as an interconnected system, network. On the logical level, you've got to take time for education and training. You can't do it on the average. Don't succumb to the temptation to get it out of your office. This again, you focus on the individuals that really have the leverage. I do a lot of triage in my work. I try and do my market research to figure out what leader, whether formally or informally, whether physical, logical, emotional, however that person has a constituency, I try to work one-on-one with that person in order to be able to affect the transformation in that person. My theory is that and it can be frustratingly slow, but in the long term, I think far more effective. And in the long term, when you look at how good a job it is, I think it may end up being quicker. Because that person, once transformed, brings along the constituency, however that person has it, whether it's physical, logical, or emotional power. So that's extremely important. You have got to spend a good part of the first year, and I've laid out a pretty typical schedule on that, but it's pretty much the better part of the first year just working with the top management, letting the rest of the organization know in awareness sessions what's going on, but making it the actions of the top leaders speak for themselves, not getting it out of the office real quick. Understanding profound knowledge for executive questions. This is extremely important. The elements of profound knowledge, systems, variation, theory of knowledge, epistemology, and psychology. Those are the 4 areas that Dr. Deming has highlighted. One of the things that you've got to recognize is that, and this is where profound knowledge helps, is that because leaders have treated their questions as they're cheap. Questions are cheap. It's the answers that cost a lot of money. And if you don't treat your questions as though they could cost you a lot of money, you just ask questions, and you have no concept out of the thousands of staff hours that are spent trying to come up with answers to your not well thought out questions. Now, Dr. Deming yesterday spoke about experience teaches nothing. It's a very important philosophical concept, whether you're anchored, and we're not going to solve the debate now, but whether you're anchored in empiricism or whether you're anchored in rationalism, you're going to, as I said, that's not going to be solved, but the circle is essentially the same, that you've got theory. Now, some argue that theory comes from experience, others argue that theory comes first. I'm not going to solve that here. But the circle is the same. You've got theory. Theory enables you to ask questions. Without theory, you can't ask a question. Theory is some connected concepts in your mind. Given questions, you're able to take data, make observations, bring order to the sensory input that you're getting, and you proceed on from there. The important thing is that leaders need to ask better questions. And so one of the things that I help people with is, how do you ask better questions? And you go back to the theory to ask those questions. One of the things that you do in order to help people to ask better questions, this gets you back into the physical world again, if I can control the reports that you see, I can make sure that some questions will always get asked, and I can absolutely guarantee that you won't have a clue to ask other questions. So the reports are the leader's incoming material. And if I can control that, and that's what I do focus on, one of the first things I do on this, what I mentioned on the physical level, the reporting system at General Motors, if I can control that, I can pretty much dictate the tempo of a lot of what happens in the front office, because that's what you people go by. And it's all part of the knowledge cycle. On the emotional cycle, the fear of giving up control. This is as I stated earlier, every person, each of us wants to feel important or to be important as an individual and as a part of a family. Part of that sense of importance, especially in Western cultures, whose view of leadership is more active, is more follow me, is more John Wayne kind of a thing. You don't see it too much in Eastern cultures. Eastern cultures using the Lao Tzu passive, when it's done, they'll think they did it themselves kind of a thing. Very low ego. Over here, you see, but you also see it a bit in the Eastern philosophies as well, but really over in Western cultures. There's that sense of, I'm important because of the control that I have, either control of people, control of the methods that you use, control of the equipment, control of the environment, all of the aspects of a process, people, materials, methods, equipment, and environment. And there's that sense of control over that. Many people, a lot of Western, and I notice this in many of the top folks and the folks next to the top, that you have to work with them as individuals to alleviate that fear of losing control. That's very important to many, many people. Now, one of the ways that I've done that is to build on their sense of importance. You don't necessarily take something away without addressing the need for people to feel important. It's not enough to take away barriers, that lack of a negative. All of you, I'm sure, do postmortems and you look at what can I do to eliminate the barriers? Well, at the same time, you have to ask the same question, what can I do to strengthen the enablers? What can I do to improve our strengths? It may be that you should forget the barriers and work on stuff that's a strength, and that would be far more effective. In any event, working on the strength of how can I help those leaders feel just as important, to come past their anxieties, go past their fears, and that's the only way people can grow, by working on establishing a value system, working on establishing a stewardship, working on passing on and developing their people, and not just making the statement, boy, if I hadn't been at that meeting, they wouldn't have come to that conclusion. And getting, in many cases, a false sense of security of their importance. So you have to work on that sense of helping them get past that fear of giving up control. Another Western view, typically, is that fear that they will admit that they didn't know everything to begin with. Don Peterson was especially important and very secure and very effective when he stood up there as a chief executive officer saying that Dr. Deming taught me something. I really didn't realize that this concept of continual improvement is so important. I figured that if you get an assignment, you've got the job done when you complete the assignment, and then you go off to another assignment. I didn't realize that no matter how good you are, that you always have an opportunity to get better. And in fact, in the auto industry, in bits and pieces now, but it was universal 10 years ago, when you spoke about improvement, that meant you were in extremis on the low side and you were goofed up and someone needed to talk to you about improving. Improvement was an aspersion. That was not a good thing to talk about. You're on the improvement process or program. That meant you were just about ready to be fired. So improvement is an opportunity. No matter how good you are, no matter how where you are on the scale, you can always get better. And that should be an opportunity. So we needed to work through that fear of admitting it would be a sign of weakness in Western cultures for a leader to admit that he or she really didn't know it all. Now, your people already know you don't know it all. It's just that you've got to come to the conclusion of making it public. Market research for the joy of ownership, extremely important. Again, at both companies, they had a very good idea of what the hell the customers didn't like. But to paraphrase a market research story, as we did this in Ford worldwide, there's one of these managers in Ford of Australia picked it up immediately, said, well, you know, it's like you don't go to a restaurant doing your market research here. You don't go into a restaurant and tell the waiter or waitress, I don't like steak, I don't like potatoes, and I guess a couple of years ago, well, last year, it was politically correct to say I don't like broccoli. I just told you what I didn't like. You designed me a meal that I'm going to brag about. So one needs to begin to deal with doing the market research to figure out what it is that you think the customer is going to brag about. We all know all sorts of stuff and what won't work and what they don't like. You're not going to get to what they really brag about unless you begin to change your market research. And that's one of the things we did. And the new appraisal process. On this emotional level, Ford, back in '83, was the first company in the world to begin to actually pioneer and work on some of the things Dr. Deming was talking about in this appraisal area. We were able to make great strides at what we did at Ford. Didn't go far enough. Never is. There's always room for continual improvement. One of the things we were able to do at GM is leverage off of what Ford did, and we're able to go a little bit further at GM. It can be done. We spent, that was an important part of what I did, helping people come to grips with the appraisal process. Very quickly, we came to three main questions. Questions are more important than the answers. Three main questions in the appraisal process. The answers to those questions are going to be different for each company that you belong to, but essentially the questions are fairly predictable. The questions that your appraisal or development process has to answer is, how can you help your people feel important as individuals? How can you help your people feel or be important as part of a team? And how can you help the leader of the team improve the whole team? So 2/3 of it is focused on the individual, 1/3 of it is focused on the leader of the system, however you define the system. And if you and some of the answers are interesting. We don't have time for that. Peter's going to give you some of his opinions on how to approach that. But there were some very exciting things that have been done in the auto industry in that. Now the public doesn't appreciate some of the stuff there, but you're going to see some very good things in these next coming years. Since we're on the emotional level, I wanted to share with you one way that Dr. Deming deals with his emotional needs. And I want to show you a picture of Dr. Deming and my cat Sylvester. Dr. Deming likes cats a lot, and when he comes over to the house, it's very soothing. So after a busy day, cats can help. Now, I know you dog people aren't going to appreciate that, but cats can help your emotions immeasurably. So with that, it is 9:30. We have a brief 15-minute break. A lot of people have asked me, Bill, how long is this going to take? I know it's the longest hour and a half in your life, but my answer has been fairly constant over these years. My answer to Western managers is, it's going to take a long time. It's going to take about 20 years to make this transformation of an organization of any size. My answer to Eastern cultures, Eastern managers is, it's not going to take long at all. About 20 years. It all depends on your perspective. Thank you very much.